the Blessed and Ever-Glorious Virgin Mary, sprung from the royal race and family of David, was born in the city of Nazareth, educated at Jerusalem, in the temple of the Lord. Her father's name was Joachim and her mother's Anna. The family of her father was of Galilee in the city of Nazareth. The family of her mother was of Bethlehem. Their lives were plain and right in the sight of the Lord, pious and faultless before men. These are the lines, beautiful in their simplicity and clarity, with which the Gospel of the Birth of Mary, one of the so-called lost books of the Bible, begins. These lost books, more than a score in number, and not infrequently approximating, in certain passages, the text of the Gospels, the Acts and the Epistles were omitted from the various authorized translations of the New Testament, but though they are not canonical, they are, indubitably, of great antiquity. The Gospel of the Birth of Mary is attributed to Saint Matthew, and it was certainly considered authentic by many of the early Christians. I do not know of any reason why we should hesitate to so consider it, too. In the main, even if we decide to accept the verdict of those chroniclers who maintain that Mary was born, as well as educated, in Jerusalem. But when we go further back into the story of Saint Anne, we must admittedly depend on tradition and legend, folk song and vision. As a matter of fact, I do not know why we should hesitate to do this either. I shall never forget the good counsel once given me by a wise and understanding Mexican cleric. We Catholics have two priceless treasures, he reminded me, a treasure of gold and a treasure of silver. Our treasure of gold lies in the scriptures and divine tradition, on which our church is founded. These we are bound to believe. Our treasure of silver lies in the popular traditions, which we may accept or not, as we choose, but we are nearly always the happier for being done so. Granted that the stories describing the earlier part of Saint Anne's life are sometimes confusing because they are slightly contradictory, and that they seem to range in fields of fantasy, rather than to be set on the solid foundations of fact. They are believable as to background, charming as to setting, and symbolic as to message. Rightfully, they deserve an honored place in our silver treasure. I have pored over them reverently as well as studiously, and I feel that their conflicting elements are relatively unimportant, and that whether their fantastic elements should be explained, at least they can and should be interpreted. So here are the results of my prayerful effort to do so. Early in the century before the Christian era, a patriarchal family belonging to the tribe of Levi took refuge on the barren plateaus at the north of Galilee. The little group had not voluntarily left the pasture lands of their natural habitation. They were refugees from the conquering hordes of Romans which had swept over Palestine and brought it under the rigid rule of Caesar. They eked out a bare existence in the desert, but the wild grapes and figs on which they tried to subsist, and the rude huts and caves which formed their shelters, were little to their liking. They missed their flocks and their fields and their well-ordered homes in the villages that adjoined their pastures so much that, as soon as they dared, they went cautiously back to the townie surrounded by fertile meadows from which they had come. By tradition, their way of life was nomadic as well as pastoral, however. The necessity of continued movement, imposed by continued wars and rumors of wars, was not a great hardship, and they did not always remain in or near the same village. It is not clear just when they went from one to another, but among those where their chief and his wife made their home were Sepphoris, Bethlehem, and Hebron.
The elder daughter of this couple, his Marian, was apparently born in Sepphoris, but when she was 8 years old and her little sister Anne was born, they may have already gone on to Bethlehem. It does not greatly matter. Both were lovely little villages, set in a green countryside and surrounded by mountains. In both, the flat roof of the better houses served, to a large degree, as it still does, for the family living room, except during the heat of midday in summer and the cool of the evening in winter. The furnishings of these houses were simple, almost sparse according
to our modern standards, and very often the rocky surface of the mountainside formed their rear walls, at least in part, giving them a certain cave-like quality, such as may still be seen in many houses, not only of that region, but also in Spain, France, and doubtless elsewhere in regions with which I am unfamiliar. But there was a tranquility and a graciousness in the way of life among those who inhabited them. They were not needy people, and for the most part they were not ignorant people, partly because their needs were few, and partly because they were frugal, provident, and studious. But they made a virtue of hospitality, and their family life was harmonious. Children were brought up to honor their father and their mother, and not only to learn, but to keep all the commandments. Their general education included the law and the prophets. This is the sort of atmosphere in which Anne's mother grew up. Like every normal Jewish girl of her time, she looked forward to early marriage and abundant maternity, and like every Jewish girl nurtured in the fear and admonition of the Lord, she was watchfully waiting for the coming of the Messiah, whose birth had been foretold by the prophets, and had cherished the hope that she might be his mother. Before her marriage, she had visited a hermit, highly reputed for holiness, who had told her that, though she would not have a son, she would have a daughter, who in turn would give birth to a most holy virgin, even the future mother of God. It was natural that, after this, she should wait for some experience of her own that would seem to confirm the prophecy, and watch for special signs of favor from heaven in her firstborn, a girl named Marian. But up to the time this elder daughter was married to Eliud, a young neighbor, no such signs had appeared, nor did they do so when Marian, the year after her early marriage, gave birth to a daughter whom they called Elizabeth. With Anne, it was different. Her mother had almost given up hope of having a second child when one evening, as she was kneeling in prayer on her housetop, she saw a strange light. Soon this light seemed to encircle her like fire, and out of the air came a clamorous sound, which gradually took the form of words, repeating the hermit's promise. At almost the same hour, her husband, who was still in the fields with his flocks, beheld a fiery cloud, and from it came a mighty voice telling him that, on his return to his home, he would find written upon his couch 4 letters which had not been placed there by the hand of man, and that these letters would form the name of the child which should be born to his wife through the will of God. The vision faded, leaving the quietude of twilight over the peaceful meadow. The shepherd hurried home and entered his bedchamber. His wife was there before him, kneeling in wonderment beside the couch on which ANNA was written in letters of gold. The meaning of the word, in Hebrew, is grace. Neither husband nor wife doubted that their joint vision had a celestial origin, or that their next child would be the mother of a holy virgin. And the grandmother of the Messiah. The miraculous manifestations continued, and everything about the birth of their baby seemed propitious and significant to her happy parents. The golden letters, spelling the name Anna, appeared in various other parts of the room besides their couch and were imprinted on their little daughter's breast. They kept this partially uncovered, so that the crowds that came to see her might share their wonder and their hope. Among the throng were hermits from Carmel, shepherds from the fields, neighbors from the village, and there was one stranger from Nazareth, a man of wealth and distinction named Sarai, who could not see the golden letters, for he had been blind from birth. But he came with faith, and entering the room where the child lay at her mother's side, asked that the baby's tiny hands might be placed in his. When this had been done, he moved them gently, so that they would cover his eyes, and said with confident earnestness, "Daughter of God, open my eyes, that I may behold the wonders wrought by you in heaven." And immediately he saw and praised God for his wonders. 8. So even in her infancy, Anne's work of healing, which has gone on through the centuries since her life and death, had already begun. But there is nothing to indicate that the excitement which surrounded her birth continued indefinitely. On the contrary, though authorities disagree as to where she spent her childhood and her youth, they seem agreed that it was peaceful as well as pleasant. According to some of these stories, her parents moved to Nazareth while she was still very young, but parted from Anne and placed her in the temple at Jerusalem for her upbringing and education. According to others, and these are the same that give Bethlehem and Hebron as temporary abiding places of the family, the household moved to Jerusalem when Anne was 9 years old, that is, shortly after her elder sister's marriage, and went to live near the temple where her father had been summoned to take a permanent position, in recognition of the sacerdotal services performed by his ancestors as well as of his own worth. Profiting by his connection there, he entrusted the education of his daughter to the scribes who were among his friends, and later, to certain doctors of the law. But his duties did not interfere with the periods that he still spent among his flocks. Like other Levites, he had the inherent right to a tract of land 1,000 paces wide outside the city, and, little by little, he acquired additional plots. And when he went into the country to oversee his pasture land, he took his little daughter with him. This is the version of the story that I like best, and that seems to me most plausible. Marian, the elder daughter of the devout couple, was undoubtedly married when Anne was still a little girl. It would have been natural for them to keep the younger one at home, especially as by so doing, she could have all the privileges of an urban dwelling and a good education at the temple, because of her father's connection with it. But without going to live there, she could also have had the advantage of country life, which he was able to give her. 7. From the terrace of her home, she could look out on the shrines at the south, and above the fortifications at the east, she could gaze on a horizon which offered a series of wonders. First, gazing downward, she would see the Valley of Cedron, so called because of the cedars which bordered the stream which flowed through it. Then, glancing upward, the Mount of Olives farther off, on a vast expanse, the tableland and mountain ranges that rose before the Dead Sea. Still more distant, envisioned rather than beheld, the mountain of Moab from which Moses, before he drew his last breath, had been allowed his one fleeting rewarding glimpse of the promised land. This pleasant landscape, giving it life and meaning, were straggling cattle, small flocks of sheep with a few goats scattered among them, and climbing the steep paths of the thyme-scented hills, countless sure-footed donkeys. Last, but not least, from time to time, a caravan of camels wound its way majestically across the bright plains. But this animated beauty of the fields absorbed only part of Anne's attention. She learned the history and geography of Israel, mathematics, natural sciences in as far as they were then recognized and studied, in short, the practical and familiar arts, all leading, as they should, to the greater glory of God. She learned how the universe came into being, or rather, the world in its relation to the universe. This mystery was represented, at Tibet era, in the form of 7 tableaux, representing 7 days, the origin of the week's division. She learned of God's plans for his people, her people, and the fulfillment of these plans from the time of the creation, the calling of Abraham, the foundation of the 12 tribes of Israel, the reign of David, that great king destined to be the forefather of the Messiah. She learned astronomy, and through her study of the sky, the division of the year into months: Shaddat, Adar, Nisan, Iyar, Sivan, Tammuz, Ab, Elul, Tishri, Hesvan, Kislev, and Tebeth. Above all, she learned to remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. But none of this advanced education interfered with practical household duties. These were so well organized, however, that they were never an interference or a burden. The day began, as it ended, with prayer. Then Anne helped her mother prepare the simple dishes that made up their daily fare and learned to draw wine, with the aid of a small vessel, from the great jars placed where they would become cool. She went to fetch water from the well, with her young companions, just as her noble ancestress Rebecca had done. And when the last duty was performed and the last prayer said, she extinguished the flame of her tiny oil lamp and lay down to sleep on her narrow bed. She was lovely, she was learned, she was discreet and reverent. No wonder that, among the people where these qualities were held in high esteem, she was early sought in marriage. She had the natural inclination for it, and the careful preparation for it characteristic of her time and race. It had never occurred to her that in due course she would not marry, and that her marriage would not be a lasting and happy one, based on mutual affection and respect. To be sure, there were certain laws among the Jews, theoretically strict, which forbade marriage outside their own tribes, except under very special conditions, but young people of both sexes met frequently and pleasantly, under proper supervision. And Anne apparently had little or no difficulty in making a choice as satisfactory to herself as it was both to her parents and to those of the young man who had found favor in her sight. He was generally called Joachim, and that is the name by which he has become known to posterity, but he was also called Heliakim, frequently shortened to Hili. Like his wife's, his name seems peculiarly significant, for it means preparation for the Savior. He had a younger brother, Jacob, and they were the sons of a certain Matthias, who lived in Nazareth, and who was an old friend of Anne's parents. After the latter moved to Jerusalem, Matthias continued to visit them and to bring his children with him. Evidently, both fathers had long considered a union between their respective families a desirable objective, for though they were not of the same tribe, the special conditions which permitted a departure from established custom were not lacking. Although Joachim, as the eldest son of Matthias, who belonged to the tribe of Judah, had the rights of primogeniture, it was presumable that his younger brother, Jacob, could fulfill the tribal law designed partly to safeguard inheritance and partly to ensure perpetuity. Anne's family belonged to the tribe of Levi, and her elder sister, his Marian, had married into that tribe, so the requirements of the same law had already been fulfilled, and since, According to the prophets, it was from the tribe of Judah that the promised Messiah was to come. Anne's parents, who, like all other devout Jews of the period, hoped that a daughter of theirs might be the chosen mother of Emmanuel, were overjoyed to see in their younger child a possible channel for the fulfillment of the prophecy. It is safe to assume that the marriage of Joachim and Anne, who were then both probably about 20 years old, Joachim a little older, Anne a little younger, followed established custom. As their betrothal had done, Matthias would have come down from Nazareth, accompanied by all the members of his family. Anne's sister, his Marian, would have come from Hebron, with her husband and their daughter, Elizabeth, quite a big girl by now. Other relatives, near and far, both as to distance and kinship, would have foregathered. And all day long there would have been singing and general merry-making in the bride's house. But she would have taken no part in this. Instead, she would have remained secluded in her room until it was time for her to leave her home and go to the temple where the marriage ceremony was to take place. Early in the morning, she had bathed in fresh water and been anointed with fragrant oils before she was dressed in her wedding garments, a long violet-colored robe embroidered in flowers, with sandals embroidered to match. But it was not until evening that her two maids of honor covered her beautifully dressed hair with the long violet-colored veil which floated out behind her like a mantle, and placed the nuptial crown above it. When she had thus been prepared to greet her bridegroom, he arrived to claim her, accompanied by 10 chosen companions, who announced his approach by the music they made on their fifes and tambours. Anne's bridesmaids had also assembled 10 young girls, each carrying a lighted lamp in one hand and a sprig of myrtle in the other. Preceded by their double cortege, the bride and groom went hand in hand to the temple and took their places on the dais that had been prepared for them. The ceremony began with the reading, by a scribe, of the marriage contract, complete in every detail. This was done under the supervision of a priest, attired in gorgeous vestments. After the reading of the contract came the bestowal of the wedding ring. Next, Anne was handed a cup, full to the brim, which she passed to Joachim. After drinking from it, he gave it back to her and she drank in her turn. Then she threw it to the ground, where it broke into glittering fragments. This was the symbol of conjugal unity, shared misfortunes as well as shared joys, which brought the formal religious ceremony to an end. Night had now come on, and the young men of Joachim's cortege carried torches to light the way through the dark streets from the temple to the flower-decked room where the wedding supper was set forth. The occasion was still one of great solemnity. Not until 7 nuptial benedictions had been pronounced could the guests relax on the divans surrounding the table, and after each course, ritual ablutions took place. In between, there was laughing and drinking and jesting, along with the feasting. But the supper ended with still another benediction, and when this had been pronounced, the guests began to disperse. The light from the torches was fainter now. It no longer flared into flame, but flickered as it sank into the sockets. The music from the fifes and tambours sounded more and more softly and died away in the distance. All had gone their separate ways, quietly, into the night. All except Joachim and Anne, who remained behind, together. It had been agreed between Joachim's father and Anne's that the young couple should remain in Jerusalem. As has already been said, Joachim, an eldest son, had the rights of primogeniture, but his younger brother, Jacob, was entirely capable of giving Matthias all the help required in looking after his property in Nazareth, whereas Anne's father had no son to share the responsibility of caring for his ever-increasing flocks, while he himself was more and more occupied with his duties at the temple. His other son-in-law, his Marian's husband, was too far away for Hebron, then seemed a distant place. It was natural that Joachim should fit easily into the patriarchal picture. The arrangement, from the first, was both profitable and harmonious. The flocks continued to increase. More pasture land was added to the fertile fields, which had already assured the family of abundance, and Joachim and Anne were established in a pleasant house set down in a flowering garden, close to the city walls and to a pool known as Bethesda, which the populace believed had healing powers and which, indubitably, was a source of refreshment and a place of repose. The years flowed on, peacefully and, for the most part, uneventfully, except for the faithful observance of all traditional feasts and fasts, which differed in its details, but not in its essentials, from the observance of these same feasts and fasts kept by Orthodox Jews in our own day. Every week, the Sabbath was strictly set aside as a day of rest. In the month of Adar, February, came the Feast of Purim, commemorating the deliverance of the Jews from the massacre planned by Haman 10, and this time the population of Jerusalem was in holiday mood, and Joachim and Anne joined in the general evidences of light-hearted rejoicing. In the month of Nisan March came the Passover, with the temporary cessation of all work, the sacrifice of the Paschal Lamb, and other solemn ceremonials which had remained unchanged since the children of Israel had escaped from Egypt. This was a feast of especial significance to Anne, since it was her ancestor, Aaron, the elder brother of Moses, who had been the spokesman for the Jews at the court of the hard-hearted Pharaoh. Following Yom Kippur, the Day of Expiation, and falling in the same month of Tishri, September, came the Feast of the Tabernacle, lasting 8 days. During this festival, tents were erected everywhere in the fields, on the terraces, even in the public squares of the city, to recall the long period of probation passed by the Jews in the desert and the intervention of God in their behalf. Meanwhile, every morning, a priest went to the fountain of Shiloh to draw from it water in a golden vessel and, returning to the temple, to pour this over the sacrifice on the altar, symbolizing the living waters of promise. All these festivals were beautiful in themselves and beautiful in their symbolism. They served as landmarks in the passage of the quiet years, uneventful, as we have said, for the most part. Joachim and Anne were fond of both books and music in the evenings. They read together, or Anne sang while her husband accompanied her on the harp. Their tastes were so congenial, their lives so harmonious, that they had little need for many outside diversions, and besides, when night came, they were ready for rest. Joachim continued to give the ever-increasing flocks his personal attention and supervision. This took him into the fields every day and kept him there until darkness fell. Anne continued to oversee the household, to work in her garden, to sew and spin. Flowers flourished under her care, and her garments, though simple in cut, were of many colored fabrics, skillfully draped and becomingly worn. At need, she went out into the city to do her marketing and other necessary errands, and she was faithful in her attendance at the temple and on the poor. She had a great gift of nursing the sick of both body and mind, and those in pain and distress frequently called on her for help and were never denied. She showed a special skill in her care for women, and more than once helped a midwife at the time of a difficult birth or officiated in place of one who failed to arrive. All this she did not only as part of her duty, but gladly, welcoming it as a way in which she could serve her fellow creatures and, through them, her God. No one ever felt that her help was given grudgingly, but it was in her own home that she was happiest. The streets were full of Roman soldiers, arrogant and overbearing. She shrank, instinctively, from these cruel alien rulers of her beloved country. Hordes of wretched beggars clustered in the public places where they were segregated, calling aloud on the pity of the passerby. Anne did what she could to relieve their misery, which haunted her otherwise happy life, but she was all too conscious of her own inadequacy. It would take one greater and stronger than she to deliver them from their wretchedness. In the early years of her marriage, the patriarchal group to which Anne and Joachim belonged was a large one, congenial and mutually helpful. Its members gathered together frequently, for both business and pleasure. Then the elder members of both families died, one by one, and their loss brought sorrow to the younger ones, who had loved them, but it was a sorrow softened by the memory of their parents' long, full, useful lives and the knowledge that the years of all men's lives are numbered. But there was another sorrow which could not be assuaged. This was their own childlessness. We have said before, and it cannot be too strongly stressed, that the heart's desire of every normal young Jew was for an early, suitable, happy and lasting marriage, and coupled with this desire was another, equally strong, that the marriage should be fruitful. The merits attributable to celibacy became evident only with the dawn of Christianity, when the early followers of Jesus discovered that in order to consecrate their lives entirely to his service and to help others along the way of truth, there should be no earthly ties or distractions to hinder their greatest purposes. As for the theory that a childless marriage left a couple freer to pursue their own selfish ways, that was, happily, many centuries in the future. Such had been the pronouncements of Joachim's ancestor, the great King David, and their truth had never been questioned in all the centuries that had passed since the declaration had been made. The woman who had never conceived, the man who had never begotten, felt an inheritance to be incomplete, a blessing to be limited. More than this, they felt that their childlessness was a punishment for something they had done which they ought not to have done, or something they had left undone that they ought to have done. They dreaded the moment of public reproach and public humiliation so often meted out to the childless. Anne and Joachim were no exception to this universal rule. But at the particular period of Jewish history which had now been reached, in the families belonging to the tribe of Judah, this sorrowful feeling of unfulfillment was greater than it had ever been before, and greater than it was among other families, even then. None doubted that Judah was the tribe to which would be granted the unique and supreme honor of giving the Messiah to the world, and every prophecy, every portent, pointed to the fact that the hour of his coming was not far distant. 11.
It is safe to say that in our own day and age there is hardly a mother who has given thought to her children's future who has not hoped that her sons and daughters would be preeminently successful in whatever terms she interpreted success. The more thoughtful, the more conscientious, the more cultured, have allowed their hopes to soar even higher and have striven and sacrificed, if necessary, to realize these. It should therefore be easy for nearly all mothers to understand how much higher still must have soared the hopes of those who believed themselves qualified by birth to provide a deliverer for their people, and whose whole pattern of life was planned in such a way as to make them worthy of this privilege if it should come to them. When month after month and year after year went by without the prospect of a child, Anne must inevitably have had moments of feeling that her prayers had gone not only unanswered but unheard. She must have asked herself why she and her husband, who had so scrupulously followed the law, should thus be punished. She must have dreaded increasingly the moment when their private grief would become a
public disgrace. I could, of course, attempt to tell you in my own way what finally happened. But it has been told with such infinite beauty in the Gospel of the birth of Mary, one of the so-called lost books of the Bible, and in the Protevangelium of St. James the Less, that I prefer to quote it exactly as it was written centuries ago. No words that I could put on paper could possibly tell this part of the story as vividly, as poignantly, and as exquisitely. And it came to pass that when the feast of the dedication drew near, Joachim, with some others of his tribe, went up to Jerusalem, and at that time Issachar was high priest, who, when he saw Joachim along with the rest of his neighbors, bringing his offering, despised both him and his offerings, and asked him why he, who had no children, would presume to appear among
those who had, adding that his offerings could never be acceptable to God, who was judged by him unworthy to have children, the scripture having said, "Cursed is every one who shall not beget a male in Israel."
He further said that he ought first to be free from that curse by begetting some issue, and then come with his offerings into the presence of God. But Joachim, being much confounded with the shame of such reproach, retired to the shepherds, who were with the cattle in their pastures. For he was not inclined to return home, lest his neighbors, who were present and heard all this from the high priest, should publicly reproach him in the same manner. But when he had been there for some time, on a certain day when
he was alone, the angel of the Lord stood by him with a prodigious
light, to whom, being troubled at the appearance, the angel who had appeared to him, endeavoring to compose him, said, "Be not afraid, Joachim, nor troubled at the sight of me, for I am an angel of the Lord sent by him to you, that I might inform you that your prayers are heard, and your alms ascended in the sight of God. For he hath surely seen your shame, and heard you unjustly reproached for not having children, for God is the avenger of sin, and not of nature. And so when he shuts the womb of any person, he does it for this reason, that he may in a more wonderful manner again open it, and that which is born appear to be not the product of lust, but the gift of God. For the first mother of your nation, Sarah, was she not barren even till her 80th year, and yet even in the end of her old age brought forth Isaac, in whom the promise was made a blessing to all nations. Rachel also, so much in favor with God, and beloved so much by holy Jacob, continued barren for a long time, yet afterwards was the mother of Joseph, who was not only governor of Egypt, but delivered many nations from perishing with hunger. Who among the judges was more valiant than Samson, or more holy than Samuel? And yet both their mothers were barren. But if reason will not convince you of the truth of my words, that there are frequent conceptions in advanced years, and that those who were barren have brought forth to their great surprise, therefore Anna your wife shall bring you a daughter, and you shall call her name Mary. She shall, according to your vow, be devoted to the Lord from her infancy, and be filled with the Holy Ghost from her mother's womb. She shall neither eat nor drink anything which is unclean, nor shall her conversation be without among the common people, but in the temple of the Lord, that so she may not fall under any slander or suse.
Pission of W hat is bad.
So in the process of her years, as she shall be in a miraculous manner born of one that was barren, so she shall, while yet a virgin, in a way unparalleled, bring forth the Son of the Most High God, who shall be called Jesus, and according to the signification of his name, be the Savior of all nations. And this shall be a sign to you of the things which I declare, namely, when you come to the golden gate of Jerusalem, you shall there meet your wife Anna, who being very much troubled that you return no sooner, shall then rejoice to see you. When the angel had said this, he departed from him. Afterwards the angel appeared to Anna his wife, saying, Fear not, neither think that which you see is a spirit. For I am that angel who hath offered up your prayers and alms before God, and am now sent to you, that I may inform you, that a daughter will be born unto you, who shall be called Mary, and shall be called Mary, and shall be blessed above all women. She shall be, immediately upon her birth, full of the grace of the Lord, and shall continue during the 3 years of her weaning in her father's house, and afterwards, being devoted to the service of the Lord, shall not depart from the temple, till she arrives to years of discretion. In a word, she shall there serve the Lord night and day in fasting.
And prayer shall abstain from every unclean thing, and never know
any man. But being an unparalleled instance without any pollutions or defilement, and a virgin not knowing A&V man shall bring forth a son, and a maid shall bring forth the Lord, who both by his grace and name and works shall be the Savior of the world. Arise therefore, and go up to Jerusalem, and when you shall come to that which is called the golden gate, because it is gilt with gold, as a sign of what one have told you, thou shall meet your husband, for whose safety you have been so very much concerned. When therefore you find these things thus accomplished, believe that all the rest which I have told you shall also undoubtedly be accomplished. According therefore to the command of the angel, both of them left the places where they were, and when they came to the place specified in the angel's prediction, they met each other. Then, rejoicing at each other's vision, and being fully satisfied in the promise of a child, they gave due thanks to the Lord, who exalts the humble. After having praised the Lord, they returned home, and lived in a cheerful and assured expectation of the promise of God. So Anna conceived and brought forth a daughter, and according to the angel's command, the parents did call her the name Mary. This is the story of the virgin's conception and birth, as it appears in the Gospel of the birth of Mary. Now for the story as it appears in the Protevangelium. In the history of the 12 tribes of Israel we read, there was a certain person called Joachim, who being very rich, made double offerings to the Lord God, having made this resolution, my substance shall be for the benefit of the whole people, and that I may find mercy from the Lord God for the forgiveness of my sins. But at a certain great feast of the Lord, when the children of Israel offered their gifts, and Joachim also offered his, Reuben the high priest opposed him, It is not lawful for thee to offer thy gifts, seeing thou hast not begot any issue in Israel.
At this Joachim, being concerned very much, went away to consult the registries of the 12 tribes, to seek whether he was the only person who had begot no issue.
But upon inquiry he found that all righteous had raised up seed in Israel. Then he called to mind the patriarch Abraham, how that God in the end of his life had given him his son Isaac, upon which he was exceedingly distressed, and would not be seen by his wife, but retired into the wilderness, and fixed his tent there, and fasted 40 days and 40 nights, saying to himself, I will not go down either to eat or drink, till the Lord my God shall look down upon me, but prayer shall be my meat and drink. In the meantime his wife Anna was distressed and perplexed on a double account, and said, I will mourn both for my widowhood and my barrenness. Then drew near a great feast of the Lord, and Judith her maid said, How long will you thus afflict your soul? The feast of the Lord is now come, when it is unlawful for anyone to mourn. Take therefore this hood which was given by one who makes such things, for it is not fit that I, who am a servant, should wear it, but it well suits a person of your great character. But Anna replied, Depart from me, I am not used to such things. Besides, the Lord hath greatly humbled me. I feel some ill-designing person hath given thee this, and thou art come to pollute me with my sin.
Then Judith her maid answered, What evil shall I wish you when you will not hearken to me?
I cannot wish you a greater curse than you are under, in that God hath shut up your womb, that you should not be a mother in Israel. At this Anna was exceedingly troubled, and having on her wedding garment, went about 3 o'clock in the afternoon to walk in her garden. And she saw a laurel tree, and sat under it, and prayed unto the Lord, saying,
O God of my fathers, bless me and regard my prayer as thou didst bless the womb of Sarah, and gave her a son Isaac.
And as she was looking towards heaven, she perceived a sparrow's nest in the laurel. And mourning within herself, she said, Woe is me, who begat me? And what womb did bear me, that I should be thus accursed before the children of Israel, and that they should reproach and deride me in the temple of my God? Woe is me! To what can I be compared? I am not comparable to the very beasts of the earth, for even the beasts of the earth are fruitful before thee, O Lord. Woe is me! To what can I be compared? I am not comparable to the brute animals, for even the brute animals are fruitful before thee, O Lord. Woe is me! To what am I comparable? I cannot be compared to these waters, for even the waters are fruitful before thee, O Lord. Woe is me! To what can I be compared? I am not comparable to the waves of the sea, for these, whether they are calm or in motion, with the fishes which are in them, praise thee, O Lord. Woe is me! To what can I be compared? I am not comparable to the very earth, for the earth produces its fruits, and praises thee, O Lord. Then an angel of the Lord stood by her and said, Anna, the Lord hath heard thy prayer, thou shalt conceive and bring forth, and thy progeny shall be spoken of in all the world. And Anna answered, As the Lord my God liveth, whatever I bring forth, whether it be male or female, I will devote it to the Lord my God, and it shall minister to him in holy things during its whole life. And behold, there appeared 2 angels, saying unto her, Behold, Joachim thy husband is coming with his shepherds. For an angel of the Lord hath also come down to him, and said, The Lord God hath heard thy prayer, make haste and go hence, for behold, Anna thy wife shall conceive. And Joachim went down and called his shepherds, saying, Bring me hither 10 she-lambs without spot or blemish, and the 12 calves shall be for the priests and the elders. Bring me also 100 goats, and the 100 goats shall be for the whole people.
And Joachim went down with the shepherds, and Anna stood by the gate, and saw Joachim coming with the shepherds.
And she ran, and hanging about his neck, said, Now I know that the Lord hath greatly blessed me. For behold, one who was a widow am no longer a widow, and I who was barren shall conceive. And Joachim abode the first day in his house, but on the morrow he brought his offerings and said, If the Lord be propitious to me, let the plate which is on the priest's forehead make it manifest. And he consulted the plate which the priest wore, and saw it, and behold, sin was not found in him. And Joachim said, Now I know that the Lord is propitious to me, and hath taken away all my sins. And he went down from the temple of the Lord justified, and he went to his own house. And when 9 months were fulfilled to Anna, she brought forth, and said to the midwife, What have I brought forth? And she told her, A girl. Then Anna said, The Lord hath this day magnified my soul, and she laid her in bed. And when the days of her purification were accomplished, she gave suck to the child, and called her name Mary. I am sure every reader of these beautiful passages will agree that it is in the words of the Gospel of the birth of Mary and of the Protevangelium, so fortunately still available to us, that this part of St. Anne's story should be told, and that comment on it or expansion of it by any modern writer of limited ability would be not only presumptuous, but completely futile. Neither the so-called Gospel of PSCP do Matthew, nor the Protevangelium of St. James the less mentions the birthplace of the Virgin. But as we have seen, the Gospel of the birth of Mary, also attributed to St. Matthew, refers to this as Nazareth. The author gives no grounds for doing so, nor is there any reason why he should if he was not trying to settle an argument, but to tell a simple and beautiful story, factual in as far as he knew the facts, and many reliable authorities not only accept his statement, but hotly defend it, giving all sorts of reasons, both convincing and unconvincing for doing so. On the other hand, countless equally reliable authorities contest the validity of the statement with even more fervor and bring forward their own claims to prove that the Virgin Mary was born in Jerusalem. The importance given to this debatable point by almost every thoughtful chronicler of saint. Anne's life makes me feel that it must be discussed before continuing her story, loath as I am to interrupt a normal flow of narrative which treats of events in their natural order without confusing interruption. For this is not a case of presenting one item of the silver treasure, which we are free to accept or reject as we please. It is a case of presenting two items which seem to be contradictory, and asking the reader to take his choice between them or, if he chooses, reject them both.
The claim in favor of Nazareth has been made by many writers, both ancient and modern, and has been supported by at least 4 popes. It has been widely accepted throughout the Occident, though much less widely in the Orient. All this certainly entitles it to serious consideration, if not actually to the pious belief which at one time was encouraged, while not commanded, by papal decree. But when it is analysed, the claim is found to rest very largely on legend and sentiment. Of course, there is the lovely story of the Casa Santa, borne by angels from Nazareth to Loreto,
and still visited annually by thousands of devout pilgrims, whose belief that it is the house in which the Virgin was born always has remained and always will remain unshaken, and this belief is based on the affirmation contained in a brief issued by Julian II. Many other lovely stories have been told by modern writers. One of these, Pinsinclair, recalls that the name Nazareth means city of flowers and concludes that since Mary has often been called the flower of Galilee, it follows that the Virgin came from Nazareth, just as a lily comes from a flowering garden. Still another writer, Faber, embroiders his opinion in such poetical language that the reason for it is almost lost, and describes the Virgin's childhood home in this way. She was born, according to the will of God, amidst the holy hills of Palestine, at a time when this was still a land of milk and honey. Among all its provinces, Galilee is the most pleasant, and among the villages of Galilee, Nazareth blooms like a rose. There, at the foot of a great rock, was the predestined cottage, half hidden by a thicket of fig trees, vines and laurels, sufficiently dense to serve as an oratory for Saint Anne. The house itself consisted of one room, bright and spacious in front, but hewn from the dark rock in the rear. Fallen fortunes had reduced the descendants of the great Solomon to this pass, but by way of compensation, this was the place hallowed by the childhood of Mary and her happiest days. Admittedly, Mary passed much of her girlhood in Nazareth, but this admission is not equivalent to saying that she was born there. Nor does the symbolic comparison of her to a flower constitute enough evidence to identify a village with a name which means flower as her birthplace. Moreover, it was not unusual in those days, any more than it is now, to find that the country homes of well-to-do persons were much simpler and smaller than their city homes. But the opinion that Joachim was a poor man is certainly a minority one, as far as my research discloses. Indeed, one writer goes so far as to assert that, with his accumulated wealth, Joachim had been able to acquire, in addition to his flocks, a house in Nazareth and another in Jerusalem, without counting the one in Sepphoris which came to him either by right of inheritance. It will be remembered that his father Matthias came from there, or through his marriage with Anne, who, according to tradition, was born there. According to Brother Levin, he would have had a 4th house for his shepherds on Mt. Carmel and St. Anne would have stayed there occasionally with the Virgin. In Atichen, according to certain Greek traditions, he possessed a country house near Jericho. All in all, the claims in favor of Jerusalem seemed based more on
reason and substantiated fact, and less on sentiment and story than
those in favor of Nazareth. Van der Vliet, in his carefully documented book, Sainte Marie Oil Elias ni et la piscine probatique, lists
the following cogent reasons for his firm convictions on this score. Joachim had just offered a sacrifice and consulted the history of the 12 tribes. He is therefore at Jerusalem, where the temple and the national archives are located. In leaving the temple, he did not go back
to his wife. If she had not been at Jerusalem, this statement would have been superfluous.
Anne, in her garden, is close to the fruitful waters near the vast eye.
Reservoirs of the miraculous pool, her allusion explains itself. She has just said, I am not comparable to the brute animals, for even the brute animals are fruitful before thee, O Lord. I cannot be compared to these waters, for even the waters are fruitful before thee, O Lord. Does she not seem to be designating the waters that are under her very eyes? Her expression is very significant. Joachim goes to his house in the evening, and the next day makes his offering at the temple. He, therefore, could not have been very far away from it. On the occasion of Mary's first birthday, Joachim invited the priests and chief priests to his house. He, therefore, seems to have been at Jerusalem. For how can anyone reasonably suppose that he would have asked persons of such importance to take a 3 or 4 days' journey to celebrate the birthday of a year-old child? Mary and Joachim ask, on the occasion of Mary's presentation at the temple, that the attendant virgins of Israel keep their lamps lighted until they arrive there. If their house is close to the miraculous pool, this is easily understood. But the request is hard to comprehend if the family is living at a considerable distance from Jerusalem at that time. 13. All the above conclusions are based on the text of the Protevangelium, which, incidentally, is of much earlier origin and therefore much closer to what was then current history than the Gospel of the birth of Mary. But Father van der Vliet, with admirable fairness, remarks that, if this were the only source material available for determining Mary's birthplace, one would hesitate to accept it, and mentions numerous others, among them the writings of Saint John Damascene and Saint Sophron. The latter was a patriarch of the Holy City, and both refer in their writings to the birthplace of the Virgin there. Father van der Vliet also notes that at the request of the ordinary of the Church of Saint Anne of Jerusalem, the votive masses of the Nativity of the Virgin and of the Immaculate Conception may be celebrated every day at the 2 altars in the crypt.
Obviously, if the Holy See had claimed to settle this question, one could not do otherwise than accept its decision, he goes on to say. But nothing is less accurate than the interpretation attributed to the Holy See of giving an official pronouncement on the subject of this topographical tradition. Julian II, speaking in a brief of 1507, about Tia Casa Santa of Loreto, miraculously transported from Nazareth to Dalmatia, says that according to a pious belief it is the room where Mary was conceived and where she was brought up, where when she rose from earth to heaven, at the time of her Assumption, she fell asleep while praying.
Other bulls of Leo X, 1519, Paul III, 1535, Pius IV, 1565, Sixtus V, 1586, Innocent XII, 1698, and Pius IX also mention the birth of the Holy Virgin at Nazareth. In the office of the translation of the Casa Santa at Loreto, it is said, in the 6th lesson, that this house is the birthplace of the Holy Virgin.
Benedict XIV, one of the most learned popes who has ascended the throne of St. Peter, indicates the rules which sovereign pontiffs follow in questions of this kind, that is to say, simple historical facts, completely independent of dogma. Everything that has to do with the essence of doctrine, which the popes wish to establish, must be received with complete respect. But they do not pretend to give to purely historical facts, which in no way affect either dogma or morals, any further value than that of the testimonials and proofs on which they can be based. Moreover, the bull of Julian II does nothing more than recognize popular and pious legends which are, in effect, contradictory to history, but it does not change the nature of JJs and does not seek to approve it. We have seen the force of the proofs in favor of Jerusalem, and nothing approaching these is claimed for Nazareth. It is also important to remember that the bulls of the popes following Julian I only repeat what he has said. Moreover, there is no one now who would dare place the death and Assumption of the Holy Virgin at Nazareth. The affirmation of her birth at Nazareth does not rest on any firmer.
Pope Urban IV is one of those most familiar with Oriental traditions, and especially those of Palestine, since before being elected Pope, he was Patriarch of Jerusalem and administrator of the Diocese of St. John of Acre in Galilee. It was during his pontificate that a Sultan Baybars sacked Nazareth, and Urban reports that this sultan destroyed the Basilica of the Annunciation of Mary and the Incarnation of the World, which rendered this place worthy of the veneration of Christians. But he makes no allusion to the birth of the Blessed Virgin at Nazareth. I could go on quoting, at much greater length, from van der Vliet, for he has a veritable battery of arguments to support his claim. And I strongly recommend that anyone, deeply interested in the subject, read his valuable book. But to turn from this to Charlin's, which seems to me equally valuable, let us quote the following passages. It is true that one may offer as an objection the claim for Jerusalem, and the objection seems to be a serious one, the existence of certain papal bulls. One of the principal arguments of Monsignor Mislin, the mitred abbot of St. Mary of Deg in Hungary rests primarily on the Bull of Julian I relative to the Casa Santa of Loreto, in which the birth of Mary at Nazareth is clearly supported. But as one can see merely by reading it, this pontifical document does nothing more than establish popular and pious legends. The same may be said of the bulls of Sixtus V, Innocent XI, and Pius IX, which only reproduce the text of that used by Julian I and have, historically, no other value. In the last analysis, one may maintain, as Cardinal Lavigerie, to whom the French government confided the care of the Church of St. Anne in Jerusalem in 1879 and Monsignor Mislin both say that the Holy See has wished to cut short the historical discussion on the birthplace of Mary without contradicting itself. Since on one hand it AP proves those who give Jerusalem as the birthplace of the Blessed Virgin, and on the other approves those who give it as Nazareth, one reconciles everything by saying, with Pope Benedict XIV, that the popes have meant to leave to history all its prerogatives, in a question that is wholly historical, and that they have established, as factual, only the existence of the contradictory testimonials which have been submitted regarding Mary's birthplace. 20 popes at least have caused to be inserted or attained, in the Roman breviary, the assertion of one of the most learned fathers of the Church, St. John Damascene, who affirms that the Blessed Virgin was born in Jerusalem, and only 5 popes have maintained that according to the popular belief of the populace she was born in Nazareth.